At 19, Ilara had already lost her mother, her home, and the small cushion of savings that was meant to see her through. Her two older brothers, the ones who were supposed to protect her, left her with the one thing nobody wanted: the shuttered diner on the corner of Ash and 3rd, a place of peeling paint, unpaid bills, and the ghost of failure, bought out of the estate for the single, insulting sum of $1. They laughed when she signed the paper, a soft, dismissive sound that echoed in the sterile quiet of the lawyer's office. But what nobody knew, what her brothers in their haste and her mother in her silence had never revealed, was what was hidden behind the grease-stained wallpaper of the main booth, stuffed into the walls as a strange and secret insulation. What nobody knew was that the diner's failure was a fiction, and its truth was written on the back of 1,000 unpaid guest checks. That, though, comes later. For now, there was only the girl, the dollar, the deed to a ruin, and the one small thing she had taken for herself: a single, dark wood salt shaker, worn smooth and featureless by her mother's hand. Its weight in her pocket a small, solid anchor in a world that had turned to water. First, there was the gray, a sky the color of wet wool pressed down on the day of the funeral, sealing in the damp cold that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The condolences were stiff, practiced things, handed to her by neighbors who looked at her with a kind of fearful pity, their eyes sliding away from hers as if her grief were contagious. Her brothers, Marcus and Daniel, stood beside the grave in their sharp city suits, their shoulders a hard, unyielding line. They did not weep. They checked their watches. They spoke in low tones about market timing and probate, their words like stones dropping into the profound silence her mother's absence had created. Ilara was a ghost at her own mother's farewell, a pale flicker at the edge of their crisp, efficient sorrow. They moved through the old house afterward with the detached appraisal of strangers, their fingers tracing lines in the dust on furniture that was already, in their minds, an asset to be liquidated. They decided her future in the living room, while she was upstairs, folding the last of her mother's clothes, the faint scent of flour and cinnamon clinging to the worn fabric like a final whisper. The lawyer's office a week later was worse. It was a clean, bloodless room that smelled of expensive paper and finality. The man read the will in a monotone that stripped the words of all meaning, of all love, rendering a life into a series of clauses and stipulations. The house, the modest savings, the car, it was all to be divided equally between the two sons. They had, the lawyer explained, a greater need, established careers to maintain, families of their own. Ilara's name was attached only to a footnote, a liability. The diner. The failed business, saddled with debt, its equipment outdated, its location now part of a larger parcel a developer was eyeing. Marcus, the eldest, spoke as if offering a great kindness. "We'll take on the house," he'd said. "We'll handle the real assets. You can have the diner. We'll sell it to you for $1, just to clear it from the estate. It releases us from the burden of its demolition or back taxes. It gives you something, a project." He smiled a thin, bloodless smile. Daniel, younger, weaker, just nodded, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the conference table. She felt the insult of it, the quiet, surgical way they were cutting her out, not just from the will, but from the family itself. But she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the pen the lawyer offered, and she signed. In her pocket, her fingers closed around the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden salt shaker she'd slipped off the diner's counter the last time she'd been there with her mother, a week before the end. It was the only thing she wanted anyway. The drive away from that office was a blur of gray buildings and grayer skies. She didn't look back as their sleek, dark car pulled away, its taillights shrinking in her rearview mirror until they were just two angry red sparks, and then nothing. She was alone, with $1 to her name, a deed to a failure, and a memory of a woman who people said was too soft for this world. Her mother, Lena, was a creature of quiet routine and perpetual fatigue. Ilara remembered her not as a failed businesswoman, but as a woman whose hands were never still, whose apron was always dusted with flour, whose hair always carried the scent of coffee and fried onions. The town remembered her differently. Lena was too soft, they'd say with a shake of their heads. A terrible head for numbers. She ran that place into the ground, giving away more than she sold. Ilara had heard the whispers her whole life, the casual pity directed at her mother, the way other shopkeepers would watch her with a mixture of fondness and frustration. But Lena had never seemed to notice or to care. She moved through her days with a placid, unhurried grace, her focus on the plate in front of her, the person waiting for it. She had a saying, one she repeated so often it had become the rhythm of their lives. A full plate is not a business transaction, she would say, stirring a pot of stew or slicing a loaf of bread. It's a promise. Ilara never fully understood what she meant, but she knew the feeling behind it. She had seen her mother press a warm bag of food into the hands of a shivering man huddled in a doorway, taking no money in return. She had seen her let a family of 6 eat until they were full, their bill paid with a quiet nod and a tearful, whispered thank you. Her brothers had called it charity. Lena had called it Tuesday. Mr. Abernathy, who ran the hardware store across the street from the diner, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and kindness, understood. He had stopped Ilara on the street a few days after the funeral, his hand resting gently on her arm. Your mother, he'd said, his voice a low rumble, measured a person's worth by their hunger, not their wallet. This town forgot that, don't you? He had looked at the shuttered diner then, its windows dark and blind, and a sad smile touched his lips. That place has more stories in it than the library, just not the kind most people know how to read. The words had settled in her, a small, warm stone in the cold pit of her stomach, a seed of a question she didn't yet know how to ask. Her brothers saw a failed business, the town saw a cautionary tale. But Lena had seen something else entirely. She had seen promises waiting to be kept. The call came 2 weeks after she had moved into the small, dusty apartment above the diner, the only place she could go. It was Marcus. His voice was smooth and frictionless over the line, the sound of money and impatience. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't ask if she needed anything. He got straight to the point. I have a Mr. Sterling on the line with me, he'd said. The name dropped like a heavy coin. Sterling Properties. He's the developer who's been acquiring the parcels on that block. He's ready to make a final offer for the whole corner, and that includes the diner. There was a pause. It's a good offer, Ilara. A cash offer. Quick and clean. Enough to get you a fresh start somewhere else. A real start. The implication hung in the air. Away from here. Away from the stain of their mother's failure. I'll email you the paperwork, he continued, his tone suggesting the matter was already settled. Just sign it and send it back. Sterling wants to close by the end of the month. Ilara was silent, the old receiver cold against her ear. She looked around the small apartment, at the boxes she hadn't unpacked, at the single window that looked out over the hardware store. I haven't decided if I want to sell, she said, her own voice sounding small and foreign to her. A sharp, irritated sigh hissed through the phone. Decided? Ilara, there's nothing to decide. It's a teardown. It's a condemned building waiting to happen. Let's not be sentimental over a pile of bricks and bad debt. His voice softened then, a practiced, manipulative shift. I'm trying to help you. Daniel and I, we're worried about you. This is the best thing. Take the money and go. Go to college, travel. Forget this place. But she couldn't forget. It was the only place left. I need to think about it, she said. The politeness in his voice evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, hard edge. There's nothing to think about. Sterling has friends on the city council. If you don't sell, he'll find a way to have it condemned for code violations. And then you'll get nothing. Do you understand? Sign the papers, Ilara. The line went dead. The threat was not loud, but it was clear. It was the same smiling dismissal from the lawyer's office, sharpened to a point. They didn't just want her to sell the diner. They wanted her to erase it, to erase the last physical piece of their mother's life, because its quiet, unprofitable story was an embarrassment to the loud, successful stories they were writing for themselves. The old key her mother had kept on a nail by the back door was brass, worn smooth in all the places her fingers had touched it. It slid into the lock with a familiar, gritty sound. The door groaned open on stiff hinges, releasing a breath of trapped air, a smell of stale grease, cold dust, and something else, something fainter, like dried herbs and old coffee. The inside of the diner was a tomb. Lena had covered every table, every chair, the long counter itself, with white linen sheets before she'd closed the doors for the last time. They stood now like a congregation of shrouded ghosts, their shapes softened and made mysterious by the thin morning light filtering through the grimy front windows. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of sun, a silent, swirling cosmos in the stillness. The air was heavy and cold, colder than it was outside, the kind of deep chill that settles into the bones of a place that has been without warmth or life for too long. Elara walked slowly through the narrow aisle between the booths, her footsteps echoing in the profound quiet. She ran her hand along the back of a booth, the vinyl cracked and brittle under her fingers. She stopped at the counter and lifted the edge of one of the sheets. The surface was formica, a pale marbled green, worn down to the bare wood in the exact spot where Lena had stood for 30 years, her hands bracing the edge as she leaned forward to talk to a customer, to refill a cup, to listen. Elara pressed her palm flat against that spot. It was just a cold, dead surface, but for a flicker of a moment, she felt something other than the crushing weight of her grief. It was a feeling so small she almost missed it, a tiny, stubborn spark in the darkness. It was not memory. It was not sadness. It was purpose. She let the sheet fall back into place. She had no plan. She had no money. She had only a deed to a ruin and a brother's threat hanging over her. But standing there, in the silent, dusty heart of her mother's failure, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to sign the papers. This place, whatever it was hers now. On the back stoop, a small, gray tabby cat with a stump for a right front leg sat watching her, its yellow eyes unwavering. It was the stray Lena had always fed, the one she called Tripod. It had been a fixture for years, a silent three-legged sentinel at the diner's back door. Elara had expected it to be gone, moved on to some other source of charity, but here it was, thinner perhaps, but still waiting. It did not hiss or run as she approached. It simply watched her with a kind of solemn appraisal. She went back upstairs and found a saucer and the last of her milk, setting it down on the cracked concrete. The cat blinked slowly, then limped forward and began to lap at the milk, its rough tongue making a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet alley. As she watched, the door to the hardware store across the street opened, and Mr. Abernathy emerged, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his overalls. He saw her, and his face broke into a gentle, wrinkled smile. He crossed the street, his work boots scuffing on the asphalt. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a gravelly comfort. "I was wondering when you'd come home." He nodded toward the cat. "That old stray never left, you know. Not for a day. Kept vigil, right on that spot, just like he was waiting for your mother to come open up for the morning rush." He looked at Elara, his eyes kind but searching. "She was a good woman, your mother, better than most people knew." The cat, having finished the milk, began to pointedly bat at a single loose brick in the foundation of the diner, right beside the stoop. It would tap it with its paw, look up at Elara, and then tap it again, a strange and insistent gesture. "Funny thing," Mr. Abernathy mused, watching the animal. "Always does that, drives me crazy. Been batting at that same brick for months." Elara knelt down, her fingers tracing the crumbling mortar around the brick. It was looser than the others, almost wobbly in its setting. The cat meowed, a short, sharp command. On a whim, Elara worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. The brick came free with a soft scraping sound, revealing a small, dark cavity behind it. Tucked inside was another old brass key, this one smaller, attached to a faded red ribbon. It wasn't the key to the door. It was a key she had never seen before. The days took on a shape. In the morning, she would clean. She started with the windows, scrubbing away years of accumulated grime until the light that streamed into the diner was no longer pale and weak, but a warm, buttery gold that made the dust motes glow. She washed the shrouds, hanging them on a line in the alley where they flapped in the breeze like prayer flags. She uncovered the tables, the chairs, the counter, and began the slow, arduous process of scouring every surface, cutting through layers of old grease with vinegar and hot water and sheer, stubborn effort. The work was hard, her muscles ached, but it was honest work, and with every square foot of floor she mopped, with every salt shaker she polished, she felt as if she were reclaiming not just the diner, but some small piece of herself. It was during this relentless cleaning that she began to notice the anomalies, the little things that were not quite right. The first was the main booth, the one in the back corner where her mother would sometimes sit to do her books. The wall behind it was different. While the other walls were old plaster, cracked and uneven, this one was strangely flat, covered in a thick, floral wallpaper that was peeling near the floorboards. One afternoon, while scrubbing the baseboards, a piece of the paper came away in her hand, and she saw what was behind it. Not plaster. It was a sheet of cheap plywood, nailed clumsily over the original wall. She pressed against it. It felt hollow, echoing slightly under her knuckles. The booth itself was odd, too. It was a heavy, custom-built piece, but it wasn't flush against the wall. There was a gap of several inches, and it seemed to have been anchored to the floor in a way that deliberately obscured the strange, flat section of the wall. It made no sense. Why would anyone build a false wall and then try to hide it with a booth? The question lodged in her mind and would not let go. She found the other anomaly a few days later. In her mother's tiny office, a room barely bigger than a closet, was a heavy wooden filing cabinet. The top two drawers were full of what she expected: old receipts, tax forms, supplier invoices, all in a state of chaotic disarray. The bottom drawer, however, was locked. There was no key on her mother's old ring that fit. It was a small, simple lock, but it was firm. She remembered the key she had found behind the loose brick, the one the cat had shown her. Her heart beat a little faster as she retrieved it from her pocket. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. The drawer slid open, not with the screech of old metal, but with a smooth, silent glide. It was empty, except for a single, thick ledger book bound in dark green leather. She took the ledger to the main booth, the one by the strange, hollow wall. The afternoon sun was slanting through the clean windows, and the diner was quiet except for the hum of the ancient refrigerator she'd managed to coax back to life. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her mother's familiar, looping handwriting. But it wasn't a record of expenses or profits. It was a list of names. Hundreds of names, stretching back over 20 years. Beside each name was a date, and beside the date, a series of numbers that looked like an invoice total. And then, in the final column, written in bold, declarative strokes, were two words, repeated over and over again, page after page. Paid in full. She recognized some of the names. A man who had lost his job at the mill. A young woman who had been a single mother, working 2 jobs. A family whose house had burned down one winter. These were the people the town whispered about, the unlucky ones, the struggling ones. According to this book, they had all been customers. According to this book, their debts were all settled. But she knew they hadn't paid. She had been there. She had seen her mother wave away their fumbling attempts to offer what little they had. This wasn't a ledger of accounts. It was a ledger of forgiveness. Driven by a sudden, urgent curiosity, she went back to the hollow wall. She found a crowbar in the small utility closet and with a deep breath, wedged it into the gap between the plywood and the old plaster. The wood groaned in protest, then splintered. She pulled, and a large section of the false wall came away with a crash, revealing the cavity behind it. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't empty. It was filled, stuffed from floor to ceiling, with paper. Thousands and thousands of slips of paper, bundled neatly with twine. She reached in and pulled out one of the bundles. They were guest checks, the diner's old order pads. Each one had a name at the top, a date, a list of food, hearty, simple meals, meatloaf, stew, pancakes, coffee. And on the back of every single check, in her mother's same cursive script, was a small note. Paid in full, each one began, followed by a reason. His boy is sick. Lost the job at the mill. Just looked hungry. Her car broke down again. A long week for a good soul. It was an archive of quiet grace, a secret history of the town's hidden pains and her mother's silent response. The diner hadn't failed. It had been a vessel, a conduit for a kind of currency that couldn't be banked or counted. The insulation wasn't for warmth. It was to hold, to bear witness. She stood there, in the dust and the cold, holding a slip of paper that was worth nothing and everything all at once. The flimsy record of a single meal that was, in truth, the record of a promise kept. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. It is one thing to discover a secret, to unearth a hidden truth in the dust and silence of an empty room. It is another thing entirely to have that truth tested, to have the world in all its loud, transactional certainty come knocking at the door. And the world, in this case, arrived in a polished luxury car that pulled up to the curb one bright, cold morning, its engine purring with a sound of expensive indifference. Marcus got out of the passenger side, his city suit looking alien and out of place against the backdrop of the diner's peeling paint. From the driver's side emerged a man she had never seen before, but she knew instantly who he was. Mr. Sterling. He was older than she expected, with a tanned, leathery face and eyes that were small, quick, and intelligent. The eyes of a man who saw the world as a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. They did not knock. They used a key Marcus must have had copied, and walked in as if they owned the place, their expensive shoes scuffing on the floor she had just finished mopping. They stopped short when they saw her, standing by the counter, the green ledger open in front of her. They saw the clean windows, the polished tables, the gaping hole in the wall with the bundles of paper stacked neatly beside it. A flicker of annoyance crossed Marcus's face. "What is all this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the room. "Are you playing house, Ilara?" Mr. Sterling simply smiled, a thin, professional contraction of the lips that did not reach his eyes. "So, this is the place," he said, his voice smooth and confident. He walked around, tapping a wall here, peering at the ceiling there. "Good bones, but the value is in the land, of course, the location." He turned to her, his smile fixed in place. "Young lady, your brother tells me you've been hesitant to sign my offer. I can't imagine why. It's more than generous for a property in this condition." He named a figure, a number almost double what Marcus had quoted her on the phone. It was a lot of money, enough to change her life. But it was offered as a dismissal, a final, non-negotiable price for a thing he considered worthless. "I've already had the demolition permits approved by the city council," he added, his tone casual, as if mentioning the weather. "We're scheduled to clear this whole corner in 30 days. My offer is your only way of getting anything out of this. After that, it's just a pile of rubble." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare on the clean counter between them. Beside Marcus, Daniel had been silent, his gaze shifting from Ilara to his brother to the hole in the wall. He looked pale and uncomfortable, his suit suddenly looking too big for him. He saw the ledger on the counter, his eyes catching on the familiar handwriting, and a flicker of something, shame perhaps, or memory, crossed his face. "She's not selling," Ilara said, her voice quiet but clear. The words hung in the sunlit air of the diner. Marcus laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Don't be ridiculous. Of course she's selling. Mr. Sterling's smile finally faded. His eyes narrowed. 30 days, he repeated, his voice losing its manufactured warmth. The offer stands for 24 hours. After that, you can deal with the city. It was a pleasure to meet you. He turned and walked out, Marcus following at his heels, casting one last, furious look at his sister. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his mouth opening as if to speak, but then he seemed to shrink, and he turned and followed his brother out into the cold, bright morning. The luxury car purred away, leaving only the scent of exhaust and the echo of a deadline. 30 days. The clock had started ticking. That night, the diner was cold again. The warmth of her labor had dissipated, replaced by the chill of the coming fight. She sat in the main booth, the stacks of guest checks piled on the table around her, a mountain of paper evidence. She felt overwhelmed, small against the forces now marshaled against her. How could she, a 19-year-old girl with nothing, stand against a wealthy developer with the city council in his pocket? How could she make them understand that the value of this place could not be measured in square footage or demolition costs? She felt a desperate need to hear her mother's voice, to ask her what to do, to understand the purpose behind this strange, secret generosity. She began to go through the bundles of checks one by one, sorting them by year, looking for some clue, some final message. She worked late into the night, the only light coming from a single bare bulb hanging over the booth. And then she found it. In the very last bundle, tucked into the center of the stack, and dated only a month before her mother had closed the diner for good, was a thick, sealed envelope. It was not a guest check, it was a letter. On the front, in Lena's familiar script, were 4 words: "To whoever finds this." Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was several pages long, written on the back of old order pad paper. The words were not the words of a failed businesswoman, but of a woman who knew exactly what she had been doing, and why. "If you are reading this," it began, "it means you have found my real ledger. It means you have looked past the peeling paint and seen the heart of this place. I am glad it was you." Ilara's eyes filled with tears. They will tell you this diner was a failure. They will measure it in profit and loss, and they will be right by their accounting. But their accounting is wrong. I learned a long time ago that there are 2 kinds of hunger in this world: the hunger of the belly and the hunger of the soul. This place was meant to feed both. The town was hurting. The mill closed, the farm struggled. Good people were losing everything. I couldn't fix their lives, but I could fill their plates. I could give them a warm place to sit for an hour and feel like a person, not a problem. I could give them a promise that, at least for one meal, they wouldn't be hungry. The letter went on to explain the false wall, how she had built it herself one weekend, a secret place to store the promises she had kept. She wrote of the people whose names were on the checks, telling small stories about their lives, their struggles, their dignity. She knew them all. "They will want to tear this place down," the letter concluded. "They will see it as worthless bricks and mortar. They will offer you money for the land. Do not sell the bricks. Sell the food. The real recipe for this diner isn't written on a card in a box. It's in the need of the person who walks through the door. You'll know what to do." This place was never a business. It was a promise. Now it is yours to keep. She folded the letter, her hands no longer shaking. The paper was flimsy, but the words were a foundation. It was not just a letter. It was an inheritance. It was permission. And it was a burden. She looked up, out the dark window towards the hardware store. The 30 days Mr. Sterling had given her were not a deadline. They were a head start. The morning of the 30th day dawned clear and cold. A thin layer of frost silvered the rooftops and the pavement glittered in the early sun. At precisely 9 o'clock, Mr. Sterling's car pulled up to the curb, followed by a large, yellow bulldozer on a flatbed truck and a pickup with a crew of workmen. Marcus and Daniel got out of the car with Sterling. They wore the same grim, determined expressions they had worn a month before. They were here to witness the end, to supervise the erasure. But as they approached the diner, they stopped. There was a long line of people stretching from the diner's front door down the block and around the corner. Men in work coats, women with tired faces, elderly couples leaning on each other for support, young people with the hard look of worry in their eyes. They were not protesters. They were just waiting, standing in a quiet, orderly line. The front door of the diner was propped open. From within came the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon. In the window, a simple, hand-painted sign had been hung. It read, "Open, pay what you can." Mr. Abernathy was at the head of the line, a thermos in his hand, pouring coffee into paper cups for those who were waiting in the cold. He gave Sterling a slow, deliberate nod. Inside, Elara was at the grill, her mother's old apron tied around her waist. She moved with a calm, practiced efficiency, cracking eggs, flipping pancakes, her face set with a look of quiet resolve. Sterling, flanked by the brothers, pushed his way through the door, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice booming in the suddenly quiet room. "Your time is up. This property is being demolished. Today." Elara turned from the grill, her spatula in her hand. She did not raise her voice. "These people are hungry," she said simply. "I'm feeding them." A man sitting at the counter, a burly mechanic whose name was on a dozen of the hidden checks, stood up. "This place isn't yours to demolish," he said, his voice a low growl. He looked Sterling dead in the eye. 15 years ago, I was a kid living in my car. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. Lena, she took me in. She fed me. Every day for a year. Never asked for a dime. She told me to just pay it forward when I could. This place saved my life." A woman from one of the booths stood next, a nurse from the local clinic. "When my husband left me, I was working 2 jobs just to keep my kids fed. There were nights I came home and there was nothing in the cupboard. I'd come here, and Lena would pack me up a hot meal to take home. She told me it was a special, on the house. She did that for months." One by one, the people in the diner began to stand up. The people from the line began to crowd into the doorway. They were the names from the ledger. They were the stories from the backs of the checks. They spoke not with anger, but with a powerful, simple dignity, their testimonies building one on top of the other, a wall of human truth far stronger than the brick and mortar Sterling had come to destroy. His spreadsheet logic, his world of permits and property values, began to crumble under the weight of it. He was not facing a single 19-year-old girl. He was facing the collective memory of a community, the sum of 1,000 quiet, unseen acts of grace. Daniel had been standing behind his brother, his face growing paler with each story. He saw the faces in the crowd, faces he had known his whole life, people who had been kind to him when he was a boy. He saw the mechanic who had fixed his first bicycle for free, the nurse who had bandaged his knee when he'd fallen. He looked at the hole in the wall, at the stacks of checks, and he finally understood. He saw his mother not as a failure, but as a quiet giant who had held this town together with coffee and kindness. The shame that had been flickering within him for weeks ignited into a hot, cleansing fire. He took a step forward, away from Marcus and Sterling. His voice, when he spoke, was shaking, but it was clear. "She's not selling," he said, looking at his older brother. This place isn't ours to sell. It was never about the money." Marcus turned on him, his face contorted with rage. "Have you lost your mind? Don't listen to this nonsense." But Daniel was no longer listening to him. He looked at Elara, his eyes full of a sorrow so profound it seemed to crack him open. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he turned, walked behind the counter, took off his expensive suit jacket, and laid it carefully on a stool. He rolled up the sleeves of his crisp, white shirt, turned on the tap at the big industrial sink, and began to wash dishes. The simple, humble act was a confession, an apology, and a beginning. It was the first honest work he had done in years. The sound of him scrubbing a plate cut through the tension in the room. Mr. Sterling looked from Daniel to the crowd to Alara at the grill. He saw the foreman of his demolition crew standing in the doorway, his hard hat in his hands, his face a study in dawning comprehension. The developer's world of leverage and intimidation had no power here. He had been defeated not by lawyers or by money, but by a meatloaf recipe and a room full of memory. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the diner. Marcus stood alone for a moment, his world rendered meaningless, his certainties shattered. He looked at his sister, at his brother, at the strangers who were now, so clearly, their family. He shook his head in disgust and followed Sterling out the door. The car drove away. The bulldozer remained on its flatbed, silent and impotent. The line outside began to move again, the people coming in not just to eat, but to help. The promise was being kept. The diner did not make Alara rich. Some days, the cash box held little more than a handful of crumpled bills and a fistful of loose change. But the diner was never empty. It ran on a new kind of currency, the one her mother had always honored. The mechanic from the counter spent his weekends fixing the ancient plumbing and servicing the wheezing refrigerator, his payment taken in hot breakfasts. The nurse organized a rotating schedule of volunteers to help wait tables and wash dishes. A farmer, whose family had been fed through a long, hard winter, began leaving crates of fresh vegetables on the back stoop every Saturday morning, a silent weekly tithe. The community, the one Lena had served in secret, now rallied to support her legacy in the open. The hole in the wall was repaired, but not before every single guest check was carefully placed back inside, the archive restored, the silent witnesses returned to their place of honor. Daniel became a permanent fixture behind the counter. He sold his car and his fancy apartment in the city and moved into a small room for rent down the street. He was quieter now, humbled. He learned to cook, to listen, to see the people in front of him not as customers, but as neighbors. He and Alara found a new rhythm, a way of being brother and sister that had nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with shared work and a shared purpose. They were a family, forged not by blood alone, but by the heat of the grill and the quiet dignity of a promise. The diner became the town's living room, its heart. It was a place where stories were told, where burdens were shared, where no one was ever turned away for having empty pockets. It was warm, and it was loud, and it was always, always full. Found family cohered around the old wooden tables, a patchwork of souls held together by the simple, profound act of breaking bread together. Lena's name was spoken often, with a reverence and a love that had been absent when she was alive. The town had finally learned how to read the story of her life. Months passed. The seasons turned. Winter arrived, wrapping the town in a blanket of snow and silence. One cold December night, long after the last of the dinner crowd had gone home, Alara stood wiping down the counter. Daniel was in the back, mopping the floors. The diner was quiet, filled with the warm, lingering smells of roasted chicken and coffee. Through the front window, she saw him. A kid, no older than 16, huddled in the recessed doorway of the closed-down laundromat across the street. He was trying to make himself small against the biting wind, his thin jacket pulled tight, his face pale in the glow of the street lamp. He looked cold, and he looked hungry. She remembered her mother's letter, the words that had become her compass. The recipe isn't on paper, it's in the need. She turned to the warming oven, took out a plate, and filled it. A thick slice of meatloaf, a scoop of mashed potatoes with a well of gravy, a piece of cornbread. She added a slice of apple pie, then covered the plate with another to keep it warm. She pulled on her coat and walked out into the swirling snow. The boy watched her approach, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She knelt down in front of him, the snow crunching under her boots. She didn't ask for his story. She didn't ask for money. She just set the plate down on the step beside him. "You look hungry," she said, her voice soft. He stared at the food, then up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He nodded, unable to speak. She smiled, a small gentle smile that was her mother's, and went back across the street, the snow already covering her footprints. Inside, she picked up the single, dark wood salt shaker from its place of honor on the counter, its familiar, featureless weight a comfort in her palm. The light from the diner spilled out onto the dark street, a small, warm beacon in the cold. A full plate is not a business transaction, it's a promise. And the promise was still being kept.
Right. Can this... Maybe I put this over there. No. Maybe it'll be better over here. At least you know where the real one's at. Coughs in purple. Y'all know I love you guys. Let's see. Rich, Hard Eyes over on Purple said, you probably best not leave your house for a couple days. Friendly warning. Actually, I'm not gonna say that, Nelly. Oh my god. You almost got me though. I did almost say that. Did that work? Okay, perfect. Maybe Rich was rage baiting and Purple Chat fell for it. I don't know. Rich and Roland felt very confident. Also, Lynn, I see you every day too. I'm surprised you didn't point at me. I wasn't going to point at you. That was 100% valid. Also, yeah, I see Summer too. I see so many of you guys every day. Lynn, Kat says hi. That's my baby. Okay, I'm really only putting up these lifts because we have to. Wait, if I put up this last one, are we done? No. Okay, not yet. What game is this? This is Pokemon Pokopia. Also, thanks for hopping in. Appreciate it. In the chat, we all fam. What? How many playing hours you got? Honestly, I don't know, Leo. Quite a bit now. Probably about like 30-ish. Honestly, I would have more, but I've been playing it on stream, so I've been essentially sticking to only streaming this. Or like only playing it on stream just because like some people don't have the Switch too. Some people like to follow progress and stuff like that. So yeah. You're so chill. Follows. Oh, thanks, Leo. That's so nice of you. I try to pop in almost every day. It's just very early for me. That's fair, Summer. Has Rich said anything? No. I'm dying.